So, a while back, I went to a half price books and happened to stumble upon a manga volume that had a very interesting cover. My first thought when I saw this was, wow, that horse is drawn terribly. The next thought I had was, oh, this was made by Osamu Tezuka. He's supposed to be pretty good. In case you didn't know, Osamu Tezuka was an incredibly influential manga creator in the mid-20th century, best known for the series Astro Boy. He's essentially the Stan Lee of the manga industry, except he both wrote and illustrated all of his comics. Oh, and also, Tezuka wrote a bunch of different stories in various genres as opposed to Lee, who primarily just did superhero comics. And also, Tezuka was never accused of stealing his most popular ideas from the more talented creators he worked with. Actually, Tezuka's not really anything like Stan Lee, other than the fact that he was a household name in his respective comics industry. Anyways, the entirety of this manga is comprised of only these two volumes, and they're pretty cheap, so I picked them both up, and here we are. In the distant future, Mars has been colonized by Earth and is essentially the new Wild West. People dress like cowboys, carry guns everywhere, and ride on horses to get around. One day, a mysterious stranger named Captain Ken appears and seeks to right some of the wrongs in this world. In addition to dealing with rowdy troublemakers, legendary gunslingers, and corrupt politicians, Captain Ken also seeks to help the native Martians who have been tormented by the colonization of their planet. Based on the summary alone, you could probably tell that this story is pretty dated. Captain Ken was released in 1960, and it draws heavily on the American Western genre that was popular at the time. The character Captain Ken is a very Lone Ranger type of kid. In addition to his white horse and mysterious identity, Ken is morally altruistic to a fault. He fights bad people, but always opts to have them tried in a court of law rather than dole out personal judgment. He is such a nice guy that at one point he risked dying in a gunfight with a man named Larry the Reaper rather than lying to him. This type of story is something that I could see being aired on American TV back then. It just fits in very well with all the cowboy shows that were coming out at the time. No, except the fact that Captain Ken is a 12-year-old on Mars. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention in my summary Captain Ken was only 12. Very important details. Seems like the type of thing you'd want to go back and fix in editing. Personally, I don't have a problem with this simplistic type of storytelling. I think at times it can be very fun. However, it's definitely not the type of thing that would be made today. This is partially because stories tend to not be so black and white nowadays, but mainly because the American Western genre, as it was in the mid-20th century, is justifiably being killed. Yeah, somewhere along the line, people started to realize that it wasn't a good idea to mythologize a period in time where Native Americans were tormented by white colonizers. Even when Native Americans weren't portrayed as the bad guys in these shows and movies, the general idealization of white cowboys is at best disrespectful and at worst an attempt to rewrite a heinous part of American history. Now here's where Captain Ken gets very interesting. You'd think that with all the tropes Tezuka uses from westerns, his portrayal of Native Americans would be equally tasteless, especially considering the fact that he uses inhuman creatures to represent a race of incredibly diverse people. However, Tezuka decides to go in a very different direction than the typical western. In addition to being a fun cowboy story set on Mars, Captain Ken is also an allegory of the heinous atrocities experienced by Native American tribes due to the United States' pursuit of westward expansion. I know what some of y'all might be thinking. Osamu Tezuka is from Japan. Why would he write about the horrendous actions of the US government against Native American tribes? Sounds like you're just injecting politics in this totally apolitical story. And to that I say that Tezuka isn't exactly subtle when conveying the message that he wants the readers to understand. We are told in the story that the first nation to colonize Mars was the United States. Upon being greeted by peaceful Martians, they immediately opened fire on them. While they first did this out of fear, they would continue to kill innocent Martians for their own amusement. Eventually, it got to the point where any Martian that wasn't killed was either put into slave camps or driven off their ancestral land and into hiding. I would like to mention that this is literally the first thing that we're told in the story. All of that stuff was literally just the first 5 pages of the manga. Say what you will about Tezuka, but he's not a coward that relies on something as pathetic as subtext. Captain Ken is an allegory in the absolute loosest of terms. Martians in this story are literally just Native Americans. Oddly enough, I think the blatantness of this metaphor actually makes it work a lot better. There's a lot of stories that use inhuman creatures as an allegory for oppressed groups, but a lot of the times it doesn't work because the creatures that they're using are too inhuman. The point of these stories is that bigotry and racism is unjustified, but the minority group this hatred is targeted towards are actual disgusting monsters. I think it would be completely justified to be afraid of an 8-foot tall roach creature, especially if you had to stand next to them in line at the grocery store. This also unintentionally implies that minority groups are dangerous creatures, but that we still shouldn't discriminate towards them, which, that's not a very good thing to tell people, right? Especially considering that there's a long history of propaganda distinctly dehumanizing various groups. It's kind of like saying, oh yeah, all that stuff, they're right, but like, oh no, still don't be racist towards them. Tezuka gets around this by essentially making Martians human. While they are distinctly alien in appearance, they don't have any sharp claws or acid breath that can paralyze their enemies. On their own, they are harmless. When they do end up attacking humans, they do so through the same methods that humans use. There isn't anything about them that would be a justifiable reason to fear and despise them, so it's clear that the hate they receive is completely unjust. Another important aspect in the portrayal of the Martians is that Tezuka makes it very clear that they are the victims. Throughout the story, we see time and time again the cruelty Martians experience. They are mercilessly gunned down, thrown into slave camps where they're worked to death, robbed of their land and resources by those in power. While they do violently retaliate, nothing the Martians do comes close to what's been done to them. It's very clear that despite their actions that may be deemed immoral, they are the victims, and their response to the cruelty they experienced is justified. The only time this story seems to suggest that humans and Martians should learn to live harmoniously together is at the very end, but this conclusion feels very rushed and out of place with the rest of the story. Overall, Captain Ken suggests that humans are the bad guys, and the best solution to this scenario would be to return everything stolen to the Martians and then leave. This is made more notable when you remember that the Martians are literally just Native Americans, and that a lot of the things experienced by the Martians in this story happened in real life to real-world Native American tribes. Tezuka's portrayal of Native Americans and their relationship to white people during that period of time ends up being more respectful than a lot more modern stories covering the same topic. There have been many stories about the tensions between white people and Native Americans during this point in history, and a lot of them try to make it seem like both sides had bigotry issues, or, at the very least, there were some good white people around that actually cared about Native Americans. This type of narrative is inherently flawed because it tries to blur the lines of who was right and who was wrong in that situation, when that question has an obvious answer. Sure, hypothetically, there might have been some good white people that weren't racist, and there might have been some Native American dude who was a big meanie, but I don't think either of these people existing changes the fact that Native American tribes were victims of US imperialism. Maybe if Kevin Costner spent a little less time dancing with wolves and more time trying to get Native Americans equal rights, we'd be having a different conversation. I'm amazed that a story written in the 60s by someone who is an American is a more powerful critique of our nation's history than a lot of modern stories made by Americans. Actually, it's not all that surprising considering that the Americans making these stories are often white, and that believing there were good and bad people on both sides helps alleviate some of the guilt they feel knowing that their ancestors committed horrendous acts of violence against innocent people in pursuit of power. But needless to say, I think Captain Ken's pretty good. I mean, if you can get past the very outdated art style, it's definitely a good read. I've heard the name Osamu Tezuka a lot, and I've never really checked out his work just because the style never really appealed to me. But after reading this, it's very obvious why Tezuka is such an important figure in the manga industry, and you can definitely learn a lot from reading his work. I'm definitely going to check more of his stuff out, and I hope my video gets you to check out Captain Ken. Really, it's only 2 volumes. I'm pretty sure you can find it online somewhere. If you have to pirate it, then, I mean, who's to say? Go read it, though. It's good.